There is a small town called Havenwood, nestled in the gentle hills of Vermont, where the leaves turn gold and amber every autumn, and where the air carries the sweet smell of apple orchards and wood smoke from 100 chimneys. It is the kind of place where neighbors wave from porches, where children ride bicycles down tree-lined streets, and where the seasons change slowly, as if time itself moves more gently here than anywhere else in the world. And it is here, in this peaceful corner of the world, that our story begins, on a quiet November morning when the frost still clung to the windowpanes and the world was just beginning to wake. Marcus Chen stood at the window of his small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and lavender. He held a cup of coffee in his hands, the warmth of it seeping through the ceramic and into his palms, and he let out a slow breath that fogged the cold glass before him. He was 26 years old, with gentle brown eyes and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made him look perpetually thoughtful, as if he were always contemplating something just beyond the horizon. His sweater was worn at the elbows, soft from years of washing, and it was the kind of garment that felt like a hug every time he put it on. The apartment was small but tidy, with second-hand furniture that he had carefully arranged to make the most of the limited space. A bookshelf stood against one wall, filled with paperbacks and technical manuals and a few framed photographs of his late mother, whose smile in those pictures was so warm that it seemed to light up the entire room. There was a small kitchen with a window that overlooked the alley behind the store, and a bedroom just big enough for a bed and a dresser, and everywhere there were signs of a life lived simply but with care. A knitted blanket draped over the back of the sofa, a spider plant hanging in a macrame holder by the window, a stack of notebooks on the coffee table, filled with ideas and sketches and dreams. Then Marcus had moved to Havenwood 3 years ago, following his heart to this quiet town where the woman he loved had grown up. Her name was Sophie Whitmore, and she was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like they mattered, like they were seen and understood and valued. She had auburn hair that caught the light like autumn leaves, and green eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, which was often. She worked at the elementary school as a reading specialist, and the children adored her, following her around like ducklings following their mother. Sophie came from one of the oldest families in Havenwood, the Whitmores, who had lived in the big white house on the hill for 4 generations. Her father, Richard Whitmore, ran the local bank and sat on the town council, and her mother, Evelyn, organized charity events and garden parties and was known for her impeccable taste and her exacting standards. There was also Sophie's older brother, Jonathan, who had followed in their father's footsteps and now worked at the bank himself, driving a sleek silver car and wearing suits that cost more than Marcus earned in a month. Marcus had met Sophie at the library on a rainy afternoon 2 years before he moved to Havenwood, when they had both reached for the same book at the same time, a worn copy of a poetry collection by Mary Oliver. They had laughed at the coincidence, and Sophie had insisted that he take the book, and they had ended up talking for hours in the reading nook by the window while the rain streamed down the glass and the world outside disappeared into a soft gray blur. By the time the rain stopped, Marcus knew that he had found someone extraordinary, someone whose kindness and curiosity and warmth felt like coming home. For a long time, their relationship had been a secret, not because either of them wanted it that way, but because Sophie knew how her family would react. The Whitmores were not unkind people, but they had certain expectations, certain ideas about the kind of person their daughter should be with, and Marcus, with his humble apartment and his job at the hardware store and his lack of family connections, did not fit those expectations. Sophie had tried to explain this to him gently, her hand warm in his, her eyes apologetic, and Marcus had understood, or at least he had tried to. He loved her, and he was willing to be patient, to wait for the right moment, to trust that eventually things would work out the way they were meant to. But patience, as Marcus was learning, could be a heavy thing to carry. He took another sip of his coffee and watched as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light spreading across the rooftops and church steeples, and bare tree branches like honey poured slowly from a jar. It was the week before Thanksgiving, and the whole town seemed to be humming with quiet preparation. Wreaths appeared on doors, and the grocery store was crowded with people buying cranberries and sweet potatoes and bags of stuffing mix, and there was a feeling in the air of warmth and gathering, of families coming together to share food and gratitude and love. Marcus had never had much family of his own. His mother had passed away when he was 19, taken too soon by an illness that had crept up on them both like a thief in the night, and his father had left when Marcus was too young to remember him. He had grown up with just the two of them, he and his mother, in a small apartment in the city where she worked double shifts as a nurse and still somehow found the energy to read to him every night before bed, her voice soft and steady as she transported him to worlds of magic and adventure and hope. She had been everything to him, and when she was gone, Marcus had felt like a boat without an anchor, drifting on an endless sea. Sophie had been his anchor ever since. She was the reason he had moved to Havenwood, the reason he had taken the job at the hardware store even though it paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, the reason he woke up every morning with something to look forward to, and she loved him too. He knew she did, in the way she looked at him when they walked together through the park, in the way she rested her head on his shoulder when they watched old movies on his small television, in the way she whispered his name like it was something precious. But there was a sadness in her eyes sometimes, a weight that she tried to hide but that Marcus could see anyway, the weight of being caught between two worlds, between the family she loved and the man she loved, between expectation and desire. He wished he could lift that weight from her shoulders. He wished he could be enough, be more, be the kind of person her family would welcome with open arms. He finished his coffee and set the cup down on the windowsill, then turned to look at the notebooks on his coffee table. Inside those notebooks were ideas, plans, sketches for an invention he had been working on for the past 2 years, a device that could make life easier for elderly people living alone, helping them stay connected to their families and communities, helping them feel less isolated and more cared for. It had started as a project to honor his mother, who had spent her career taking care of others and who had always believed that technology should be used to bring people together, not push them apart. Marcus had taught himself to code in the evenings after work, watching tutorials online and reading books from the library and slowly, painstakingly building something from nothing. He had no formal education in computer science, no connections in the tech industry, no resources beyond his own determination and the small savings he had managed to set aside from his hardware store paychecks. But he had vision, and he had persistence, and he had the memory of his mother's voice telling him that he could do anything he set his mind to. The device was almost ready. He had built a prototype, a small tablet-like object with large buttons and a simple interface, designed specifically for people who might struggle with more complex technology. It could make video calls with a single touch, send voice messages to family members, remind users to take their medication, and even connect them with local services if they needed help. He called it the Companion, because that was what it was meant to be, a companion for people who might otherwise be alone. But turning a prototype into a product required money that Marcus did not have, and investors were not exactly lining up to fund the ideas of a hardware store clerk with no credentials and no track record. He had sent out dozens of emails and made countless phone calls, and so far, the response had been silence, or polite rejections, or promises to get back to him that never materialized. Still, Marcus refused to give up hope. His mother had taught him that the world had a way of opening doors for people who kept knocking, and so he kept knocking, kept believing, kept working on his dream even when it felt like no one else believed in it. A knock at his own door startled him from his thoughts, and he crossed the room to open it, finding Sophie standing in the hallway with her cheeks pink from the cold and a paper bag in her hands that smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery down the street. She smiled at him, that warm, wonderful smile that made everything else fade away, and stepped inside to press a kiss to his cheek. Her lips were cold from the November air, and Marcus wrapped his arms around her and held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "I brought breakfast," she said, holding up the bag. "Mrs. Patterson had them fresh out of the oven, and I couldn't resist." Marcus took the bag from her and set it on the counter, then turned back to look at her, really look at her, and saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight crease between her brows that appeared whenever she was worried about something. "What is it?" he asked gently. Sophie sighed and ran a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture that Marcus had come to recognize over the years they had been together. She moved to the sofa and sat down, pulling the knitted blanket over her lap, and Marcus settled beside her, taking her hand in his and waiting for her to find the words. "My mother called this morning," Sophie said finally, "about Thanksgiving." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his voice calm, steady. "What about it?" "She's been asking questions about my life, about whether I'm seeing anyone." Sophie paused, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. I've been putting her off for so long, making excuses, but I don't want to lie anymore, Marcus. I love you, and I want my family to know you, to see how wonderful you are. The warmth of her words spread through him like sunlight, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what came next, the part she was not saying yet, the shadow behind her eyes. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her about you. I told her that I've been seeing someone for 2 years, that we're serious, that I want to bring you to Thanksgiving dinner so everyone can meet you." Marcus waited, watching her face, seeing the way her jaw tightened, the way her gaze dropped to their intertwined hands. "And," he prompted softly, "and she asked who you were, where you came from, what your family was like, what you did for a living." Sophie's voice grew quieter with each word. "I told her the truth, that you work at the hardware store, that you're from the city, that your mother passed away and you don't have any other family." "I see." She wasn't cruel about it. She never is. But I could hear it in her voice, that disappointment, that concern. She said she needed to discuss it with my father, and then she called back an hour later and said... Sophie trailed off, and Marcus finished the sentence for her, because he already knew, had known from the moment she walked through his door with that weight in her eyes. "She said I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving." Sophie nodded, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I tried to argue with her. I really did. I told her that you were the kindest, most hard-working person I knew, that you were building something amazing, that you were going to change the world someday. But she just kept saying that Thanksgiving was for family and that they weren't ready to meet you yet, and that maybe in time, if things progressed..." She couldn't finish, and Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her as she buried her face against his shoulder. He could feel her trembling, and he stroked her hair and murmured soothing words into her ear, even though his own heart felt like it was cracking down the middle. "It's okay," he said, and he meant it, or at least he wanted to mean it. "It's not your fault. You did what you could." "It's not okay," Sophie said, her voice muffled against his sweater. "You're the best thing in my life, and they won't even give you a chance. They don't know you, Marcus. They don't know how hard you work, how much you care, how much you're going to accomplish. They're judging you based on things that don't matter, things that have nothing to do with who you really are." Marcus closed his eyes and let her words wash over him, let them settle into the places inside him that felt hollow and uncertain. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that someday the Whitmores would see him the way she did, would recognize his worth and welcome him into their family. But right now, in this moment, all he felt was the sting of rejection, the familiar ache of not being enough. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the morning light grew brighter and the cinnamon rolls grew cold in their paper bag. Outside, Havenwood continued its quiet preparations for the holiday, unaware of the small heartbreak unfolding in the apartment above the hardware store, unaware of the young man who wanted nothing more than to belong. Eventually, Sophie pulled back and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm not going," she said firmly. "If they won't welcome you, then I won't go either. We'll have our own Thanksgiving, just the two of us. I'll cook, and we'll eat here, and it will be perfect." Marcus shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You have to go, Sophie. They're your family. You can't miss Thanksgiving with them because of me. But, no buts." He took her face in his hands, looking into her eyes with all the love he had. "I'll be fine. I have work to do on the companion anyway, and maybe this is the universe, telling me that I need to focus, to put everything I have into making this dream a reality. Maybe when I've proven myself, when I've shown the world what I can do, things will be different." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the war playing out behind her eyes, the desire to stay with him battling against the pull of family obligation, of tradition, of the life she had always known. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "I don't like it," she said, "but I understand. And I promise you, Marcus, someday they'll see you the way I do. Someday they'll realize what they missed." "I know," he said, and he kissed her forehead, soft and lingering. "I know they will." After Sophie left, with promises to call him later and assurances that she would be thinking of him the entire time she was at her parents' house, Marcus stood at the window again and watched her walk down the street, her auburn hair bright against the gray November sky. He watched until she turned the corner and disappeared from view, and then he stood there a while longer, just breathing, just being, just letting the quiet of the morning settle around him like a blanket. The rejection hurt. He would not pretend otherwise. But beneath the hurt, there was something else. Something that felt like determination, like resolve, like a small flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times the wind tried to blow it out. The Whitmores did not know him. They did not know what he was capable of. But someday they would. Someday everyone would. Marcus turned away from the window and picked up his notebooks from the coffee table, carrying them to the small desk in the corner of his bedroom where he did his work. He opened to a fresh page and began to write, pouring all of his feelings into his plans, transforming hurt into purpose, disappointment into drive. The companion was going to change lives. It was going to help lonely people feel less alone, going to give families a way to stay connected, going to honor his mother's memory in the most meaningful way he could imagine. And when it succeeded, when all of his hard work finally paid off, he would not rub it in anyone's face or seek petty revenge. That was not who he was. Instead, he would simply show up as himself, as the person he had always been, and let the truth speak for itself. But that was a long way off, and for now, there was work to be done. Marcus picked up his pen and began to write. The apartment was very quiet now, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling around him. Through the window, he could see the sun climbing higher in the sky, its light warming the frost on the glass until little rivulets of water began to trickle down like tears. The spider plant by the window seemed to stretch toward the light, its long green leaves reaching and seeking the way all living things reach toward warmth and brightness. Marcus wrote steadily for the next several hours, filling page after page with ideas and calculations and small sketches of interface designs. He wrote about the video call feature that would let grandchildren see their grandparents' faces from across the country. He wrote about the medication reminder system that would chime gently at the same time every day, a soft bell sound that would become as familiar and comforting as a friend's voice. He wrote about the emergency button that would connect users to help with a single touch, giving them peace of mind even when they were alone. Every feature was designed with love. Every detail was crafted with care. This was not just a product to Marcus. It was a promise to his mother, who had spent her final months more alone than anyone should ever be. A promise to himself that her suffering would not be in vain. A promise to all the elderly people out there who deserved to feel connected and cared for, no matter their circumstances. When the light outside began to turn golden and the shadows lengthened across the floor, Marcus finally set down his pen and stretched his aching back. He had been sitting for hours, lost in his work, and his body was reminding him that he was human, that he needed food and movement and rest. He made himself a simple dinner of soup and bread, warming the soup on the small stove while the bread toasted in the oven. The smell of it filled the apartment, warm and yeasty and comforting, and Marcus ate slowly, savoring each bite, letting the warmth spread through him from the inside out. After dinner, he washed the dishes by hand, taking his time, enjoying the simple, meditative quality of the task. The warm water, the slick soap, the satisfying feeling of making something clean. These small domestic rituals had become important to him, anchors in a life that sometimes felt adrift. They reminded him that he was here, present, alive, doing the work of living. He called Sophie before bed, as he did every night, and they talked for nearly an hour about nothing in particular. She told him about her day at school, about the third grader who had finally learned to read the word beautiful, about the autumn craft project that had resulted in glitter covering every surface of her classroom. He told her about his work on the companion, about the new feature he was developing, about the hope he was carrying in his chest like a small flame. Neither of them mentioned Thanksgiving. Neither of them mentioned her family. Some things were too tender to touch, and they both understood that instinctively the way people who love each other learn to navigate around the bruised places. When they said goodnight, Marcus felt a little less alone. Sophie's voice lingered in his ear like music, and he fell asleep to the memory of her laughter, warm and bright as sunshine. The days that followed passed in a gentle blur of routine and quiet effort. Marcus woke each morning before dawn, made his coffee, and spent an hour or two working on the companion before heading to the hardware store for his shift. The store was owned by an elderly man named Harold Green, who had been running it for 40 years and who treated Marcus more like a grandson than an employee. Harold had a kind face weathered by time and a habit of telling long, meandering stories about the old days, while Marcus stocked shelves and helped customers find the right nails or the perfect shade of paint. "You've got that look again," Harold said one afternoon, peering at Marcus over the tops of his reading glasses. "That far-off look, like you're thinking about something important." Marcus smiled and continued arranging boxes of screws in neat rows. "Just thinking about my project, Harold, the one I told you about?" "Ah, yes, the companion." Harold nodded slowly, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "You know, Marcus, I've been in this business a long time, and I've seen a lot of young people come through here with dreams in their eyes. Most of them give up after a while, decide it's too hard, settle for something safer, but you've got something different. You've got staying power." "I hope so," Marcus said. "Some days it feels like I'm just spinning my wheels, getting nowhere." "That's how it always feels right before a breakthrough," Harold said wisely. "The trick is to keep going anyway. Keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when you can't see the path. The path has a way of appearing when you need it most." The hardware store was a special place, a relic of an earlier time when everything was not so hurried and transactional. The wooden floors were worn smooth by decades of footsteps, and the shelves were lined with bins of nails and screws and bolts in every size imaginable. There were paint samples arranged like a rainbow along one wall, and a section dedicated to gardening tools that smelled of earth and metal. In the back, there was a workshop where Harold taught classes on basic home repair, passing down knowledge that might otherwise be lost to a generation more comfortable with screens than with hammers. Marcus loved working there. He loved helping customers find exactly what they needed, loved the satisfaction of solving problems, loved the way Harold treated everyone who walked through the door like an old friend. The work was humble, yes, but it was honest, and Marcus had learned that there was dignity in any work done with care and attention. On quiet afternoons, when the store was empty, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall, Harold would tell Marcus stories about his own youth, stories about building his first house with his own 2 hands, stories about the woman he had loved for 50 years, who had passed away the winter before Marcus arrived in Havenwood, stories about the dreams he had carried as a young man, some of which had come true and some of which had faded into memory like morning mist. "The thing about dreams," Harold said one afternoon, polishing the glass counter with a soft cloth, "is that they change shape over time. The dream you have at 20 is not the dream you have at 40, and by the time you're my age, you realize that the dream was never really about achieving something specific. It was about becoming someone. It was about the person you grow into along the way." Marcus thought about that often. He thought about the person he was becoming, here in this quiet town, working in this humble store, loving a woman whose family did not think he was good enough. He thought about whether his mother would be proud of him, whether she would recognize the man he had become. He believed she would. He had to believe that. Marcus thought about those words as he walked home that evening, his boots crunching on the frost-covered sidewalk, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The street lamps were just flickering on, casting pools of golden light on the pavement, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the faint sound of church bells ringing, their melody floating through the twilight like a lullaby. He thought about Sophie, who had texted him earlier to say that she missed him, that Thanksgiving at her parents' house felt empty without him there, that she was counting the hours until she could see him again. He thought about the Whitmores, gathered around their elegant dining table in their beautiful house, passing dishes of turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce, unaware or uncaring that just a few miles away, a young man was spending the holiday alone, eating a sandwich at his desk while he worked on something that might change the world. But Marcus did not feel sorry for himself. That was not his way. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude for the life he had, for the work that gave him purpose, for the woman who loved him despite everything. He had enough. He had more than enough. And someday, he would have even more. The night before Thanksgiving, Marcus received an email that made his heart stop. He had been sitting at his desk, putting the finishing touches on a new feature for the companion. When his phone buzzed with a notification, he almost ignored it, assuming it was just another rejection or another spam message, but something made him look. Some instinct. Some whisper of fate. The email was from a woman named Catherine Wells, the founder of a technology investment firm in Boston. Marcus had sent her a pitch months ago and had long since given up hope of hearing back. But here she was, writing to say that she had finally had a chance to review his proposal, that she was impressed by his vision and his dedication, and that she wanted to meet with him after the holiday to discuss the possibility of funding his project. Marcus read the email 3 times, then 4, then 5, hardly daring to believe it was real. He had sent out so many pitches, received so many rejections, and here was someone who actually believed in him, someone who saw what he was trying to do and thought it was worth investing in. He wanted to call Sophie immediately, to share the news and hear her voice and celebrate together, but she was at her parents' house, and he did not want to intrude on her family time. Instead, he sat there in the quiet of his apartment, looking at the email on his phone, and let the hope wash over him like warm water. This was it. This was the beginning. Marcus sat with that knowledge for a long time, letting it settle into his bones like warmth from a fire. He looked around his small apartment, at the worn furniture and the second-hand books and the photograph of his mother on the shelf, and he felt a wave of emotion that was part gratitude, part relief, part something he could not quite name. Perhaps it was validation. Perhaps it was hope crystallizing into something more solid, more real. He thought about calling Sophie immediately, imagined her picking up the phone, imagined the joy in her voice when he told her the news. But she was with her family, navigating the complicated dynamics of Thanksgiving with the Whitmores, and he did not want to complicate things further. The news would keep. It would be even sweeter when he could tell her in person, could see her face light up, could hold her in his arms while she celebrated his success. Instead, he replied to Catherine Wells with steady fingers, thanking her for the opportunity and confirming that he would be available to meet the following Monday. Then he closed his laptop and sat in the quiet of his apartment, just breathing, just being, just letting the magnitude of the moment wash over him. Outside, the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, drifting down past his window like tiny feathers from an unseen bird. They caught the light from the street lamp below and sparkled for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. It was beautiful, Marcus thought. Everything was beautiful tonight. He made himself a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the snow accumulate on the rooftops and the bare branches of the trees. Somewhere across town, Sophie was sitting at a table with people who did not think he was good enough for her. And here he was, alone in his apartment, holding the seeds of something that might change everything. Life was strange and wonderful and full of surprises. Marcus finished his tea and went to bed early, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept turning over the possibilities, spinning dreams that felt closer to reality than they ever had before. When he finally drifted off, it was with a smile on his face and a lightness in his heart that he had not felt in a very long time. Thanksgiving Day dawned gray and cold, with heavy clouds hanging low over the hills and the promise of snow in the air. Marcus woke early, as he always did, and made his coffee, and stood at the window watching the world wake up around him. The streets were empty. Everyone tucked safely inside with their families, and there was a stillness to the morning that felt almost sacred, like the town itself was holding its breath. He thought about driving out to the Whitmore house, parking at the end of the long driveway, and just watching from a distance, imagining what it might be like to be inside, to be part of that warmth and togetherness. But he pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. That was not who he was. He would not stand on the outside looking in, wishing for something he could not have. He would build his own warmth, his own togetherness, his own life. Marcus spent the morning working on the companion, refining the interface and testing the video call function, and making notes about things he wanted to discuss with Catherine Wells at their meeting. He ate a turkey sandwich for lunch, a small acknowledgement of the holiday, and he called Sophie in the afternoon, listening to the sound of her family in the background, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. "I miss you," she said softly, stepping away from the noise to find a quiet corner. "It's not the same without you here." "I miss you too," he said. "But it's okay. I've been productive, and I have good news to share with you when you get back." "Good news?" He could hear the curiosity in her voice, the hope. "What kind of good news?" "You'll see," he said, smiling even though she could not see him. "It's a surprise." They talked for a few more minutes, just quiet, comfortable conversation, the kind that came from years of knowing each other, of loving each other. And then Sophie had to go, summoned back to the table by her mother's voice, and Marcus said goodbye and hung up and sat in the silence of his apartment, feeling strangely at peace. The meeting with Catherine Wells was scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving, and Marcus spent the intervening days preparing obsessively. He put together a presentation, rehearsing it in front of his bathroom mirror until he could deliver it smoothly and confidently. He gathered all of his research, his prototypes, his testimonials from the elderly people in town who had agreed to test the companion and who had responded with enthusiasm and gratitude. He bought a new shirt, something nicer than his usual flannel and sweaters, and he ironed it carefully and hung it on the back of his door. Sophie drove him to Boston on the day of the meeting, her hand resting on his knee as they wound through the countryside, past bare trees and frozen fields and little towns that looked like postcards. She was nervous for him, he could tell, but she tried to hide it, filling the car with cheerful conversation and music from the radio and occasional reassurances that everything was going to be fine. "You're going to be amazing," she said as she pulled up in front of the sleek glass building where Catherine Wells's office was located. "She's going to love you and your idea, and this is going to be the start of something incredible." Marcus took a deep breath and looked at the building, so different from the hardware store and the quiet streets of Havenwood, so intimidating and modern and full of possibility. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." "I know so," Sophie said, and she leaned over to kiss him, soft and sweet. "Now go in there and show them what you're made of." The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, Marcus had secured $100,000 in seed funding for the companion. Catherine Wells was a formidable woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, but beneath her professional exterior, Marcus could see a warmth, a genuine interest in what he was trying to do. She asked pointed questions about his business plan and his development timeline and his target market, and Marcus answered each one as honestly and thoroughly as he could, not trying to oversell or exaggerate, just presenting his vision with quiet confidence. "I started this project because of my mother," he told her. "She spent her whole life taking care of other people, and when she got sick, she was alone a lot. She didn't have anyone to check on her, to remind her to take her medication, to just talk to her when she was feeling lonely. I don't want anyone else to go through that. I want to create something that makes people feel less alone, that helps families stay connected, that brings a little bit of comfort into people's lives." Catherine listened to him with an expression that was hard to read, and then she nodded slowly and said, "I've seen a lot of pitches, Marcus, a lot of people with clever ideas and impressive credentials. But what you have is something rarer. You have heart. You have purpose. And I think that's going to take you further than any degree or connection ever could." When Marcus walked out of the building with a signed investment agreement in his hand, he felt like he was walking on air. The world looked different somehow, brighter, more full of possibility. He found Sophie waiting for him in the car, and when she saw his face, she knew immediately, and she threw her arms around him and laughed and cried at the same time. "I knew it," she said. "I knew you could do it." They drove back to Havenwood with the windows cracked despite the cold, letting the fresh air rush in and carry away all the doubt and uncertainty that had been weighing on them. Marcus could not stop smiling, could not stop thinking about what this meant, what doors were about to open, what dreams were about to come true. But even in his joy, he thought about the Whitmores, about Thanksgiving, about the rejection that still lingered like a bruise on his heart. He thought about how they had dismissed him without ever knowing him, how they had judged him based on things that had nothing to do with who he really was. And he wondered, with a mix of hope and apprehension, how things might be, different now. Not that he needed their approval. He had never needed their approval. But Sophie loved her family, and he wanted to be part of her life fully and completely, not as a secret to be hidden or a problem to be managed. He wanted to sit at their table and share a meal and be welcomed as one of their own. Maybe now, that dream was not so far-fetched after all. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity and growth. With Catherine Wells' investment, Marcus was able to quit his job at the hardware store, though he did so with great reluctance, promising Harold that he would visit often and never forgetting the kindness the old man had shown him. He rented a small office space in town, hired 2 part-time employees to help with development and customer service, and threw himself into the work of turning the companion from a prototype into a product. There were challenges, of course. There were long nights and technical problems and moments when Marcus wondered if he had made a terrible mistake, if he was in over his head, if the whole thing was going to come crashing down around him. But every time he felt like giving up, he he thought about his mother, about the elderly people in Havenwood who had tested the device and told him it made them feel less alone, about Sophie and the future they were building together, and he kept going. The first few months after receiving the investment were a whirlwind of activity and learning. Marcus discovered that building a company was an entirely different challenge from building a product. There were legal documents to sign and financial projections to make, and countless decisions about everything from office furniture to employee benefits. He read books about entrepreneurship late into the night, took online courses about business management, and asked Catherine Wells 1,000 questions that she answered with patience and good humor. He rented a small office space above the bakery on Main Street, just 2 rooms with big windows that let in plenty of natural light. He painted the walls a soft sage green, bought secondhand desks and chairs from a going-out-of-business sale in the next town over, and hung his mother's photograph on the wall where he could see it from his desk. It was not glamorous, but it was his, and every morning when he unlocked the door and stepped inside, he felt a surge of pride and purpose that made everything else worthwhile. His first 2 hires were people from Havenwood, locals who believed in his vision and were willing to take a chance on something new. There was Jenny, a recent college graduate with a degree in computer science and an endless supply of energy and ideas. And there was Tom, a retired engineer who had spent 30 years at a big tech company and was looking for something more meaningful to do with his remaining years. Together, the 3 of them worked through the challenges of turning a prototype into a product, iterating on the design, testing with real users, fixing bugs and adding features, and slowly but surely building something that worked. The elderly residents of Havenwood were their first test users, and their feedback was invaluable. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery tested the video call feature and told them that the buttons needed to be bigger because her arthritis made it hard to tap small targets. Mr. Henderson from the library tested the medication reminder and suggested adding a voice confirmation so users could acknowledge the reminder without having to look at the screen. Clara, Sophie's aunt, tested everything and provided detailed notes on each feature, her handwriting careful and precise despite her 83 years. Every suggestion made the product better. Every piece of feedback brought them closer to their goal, and Marcus never forgot that the whole point of this endeavor was not to make money or build a company, but to help people, to make lonely people feel less alone, to honor his mother's memory by carrying on her work of caring for others. The companion launched 6 months later to quiet but enthusiastic reception. It was not a flashy product with celebrity endorsements and Super Bowl commercials. It was a simple, thoughtful device designed for a specific audience, and that audience responded with gratitude and loyalty. Orders came in from across the country, from retirement communities and family members and social workers who saw the potential of what Marcus had created. And with each order, Marcus felt a little more certain that he was on the right path. By the time the next Thanksgiving approached, the companion had grown from a small startup into a thriving business. Marcus had hired more employees, moved into a larger office, and secured additional funding that allowed him to expand the product line and reach more people. He was not a millionaire yet, not quite, but the trajectory was clear and the future was bright. More importantly, he had not changed. He still lived in his small apartment above the hardware store, still wore his worn sweaters and flannel shirts, still spent his evenings working on new features and responding personally to customer emails. He still visited Harold at the hardware store every week, helping out behind the counter on slow afternoons and listening to the old man's stories with genuine interest. He was still the same Marcus he had always been, just with a little more success and a lot more hope. Sophie's family, however, had changed their tune entirely. It started with small things. Her mother, Evelyn, began asking questions about Marcus's business, about how it was going, about whether Sophie had seen any articles about it in the news. Her father, Richard, mentioned that he had heard about the companion from a friend at the bank, who had bought one for his elderly mother. Even Jonathan, Sophie's perpetually aloof brother, seemed curious, asking Sophie at a family dinner whether Marcus might be interested, in meeting with some investors he knew. Sophie reported all of this to Marcus with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "They're coming around," she said one evening as they sat together on his sofa, her legs draped over his lap while she scrolled through messages on her phone. "Now that you're successful, suddenly they're interested in meeting you." "That's how it goes sometimes," Marcus said, not unkindly. "People are complicated. They make judgments based on limited information, and then they have to revise those judgments when they learn more." "You're very forgiving," Sophie said, looking at him with a soft expression that made his heart swell. "Most people would be angry." What good would anger do? Marcus shrugged. It wouldn't change the past, and it would only make the future harder. I'd rather just move forward, see what happens, hope for the best. My mother wants to invite you to Thanksgiving this year, Sophie said quietly. She called me this morning to ask. She was very enthusiastic about it. She said she'd heard wonderful things about your company and that she was so proud of how hard you'd worked. Marcus sat with that information for a moment, turning it over in his mind like a smooth stone in his hand. The invitation was what he had wanted for so long, what he had dreamed about during those lonely nights after being turned away. And yet, now that it was being offered, he felt strangely calm about it. The desperate need for approval that had once burned so brightly had softened into something more like acceptance. He knew who he was now. He did not need anyone else to validate that. But Sophie needed this. She needed her family to accept the man she loved, needed the two halves of her life to fit together without friction or apology. And Marcus loved her enough to give her that, to show up and be gracious and let the past stay in the past where it belonged. Tell her I'd be honored to come, he said finally. And Sophie? Let's not make it about the money, okay? Let's just go and be ourselves and see if we can find some common ground. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned forward to wrap her arms around his neck, holding him close. I love you so much, she whispered. You're the best person I know. I love you too, Marcus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Now come on, let's figure out what to wear. I have a feeling this Thanksgiving is going to be one to remember. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was filled with preparation and anticipation. Sophie helped Marcus pick out a new outfit, a soft gray sweater and dark slacks that she said made him look handsome and approachable. They practiced small talk together, going over topics that might come up at dinner, thinking about ways to connect with Sophie's family that went beyond the surface level of business success and financial status. Marcus also spent time thinking about what he wanted to say to the Whitmores. Not a speech. Nothing so formal as that, but a simple expression of gratitude and goodwill. He wanted them to know that he did not hold their earlier rejection against them, that he understood why they had been cautious, that he was grateful for the opportunity to finally meet them and be part of Sophie's life in a fuller way. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned bright and clear, with a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted by hand. Marcus woke early, as he always did, but today there was a flutter of anticipation in his chest, a nervous excitement that he had not felt in a long time. He showered and dressed carefully, choosing a nice sweater and slacks that Sophie had helped him pick out. Nothing too fancy, but respectable enough for a family dinner. He studied his reflection in the bathroom mirror, practicing calm, friendly expressions, trying to quiet the part of him that still felt like the outsider, the unwelcome guest. Sophie arrived at noon to pick him up, looking beautiful in a burgundy dress that brought out the green in her eyes. She kissed him on the cheek and told him he looked handsome, and they drove together through the quiet streets of Havenwood, past the hardware store and the library and the elementary school where Sophie worked, past all the familiar landmarks of the life they had built together. The Whitmore house was at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with bare oak trees, their branches reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping at the clouds. It was a beautiful house, white clapboard with black shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of house that appeared on postcards and in movies about small-town America. Marcus had driven by it many times over the years, always wondering what it looked like inside, always feeling that strange mix of longing and exclusion. Today, for the first time, he was going to find out. Sophie parked the car and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," he said, and he meant it. They walked up the porch steps together, and before Sophie could knock, the door swung open to reveal Evelyn Whitmore, dressed in an elegant cream-colored blouse and pearls, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. Her eyes swept over Marcus, assessing, cataloging, and then her face softened into a smile that seemed almost genuine. "Marcus," she said, stepping forward to take both of his hands in hers. "We're so glad you could join us. Sophie has told us so much about you." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said politely. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Please call me Evelyn." She stepped aside to usher them in, and Marcus found himself in a foyer that smelled of pine and cinnamon, with a grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner and a staircase curving gracefully up to the second floor. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, but there was a formality to it that made Marcus feel slightly out of place, like he was walking through a museum rather than a home. The living room was full of people, all of them turning to look as Marcus and Sophie entered. Richard Whitmore rose from an armchair by the fireplace, tall and distinguished with a firm handshake and a reserved smile. Jonathan nodded from across the room, where he was nursing a glass of what looked like expensive whiskey. There were aunts and uncles and cousins, too, a whole constellation of Whitmores, all of them regarding Marcus with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. "So you're the famous Marcus," Richard said, his voice deep and measured. "Sophie tells us you've built quite a business for yourself." "I've been fortunate," Marcus said, keeping his tone humble. "A lot of hard work and a lot of help from people who believed in me." "Modesty is a virtue," Richard said approvingly. "But from what I've heard, you've earned every bit of your success. That companion device of yours is making waves. A friend of mine at the club was just telling me about it last week." The conversation continued in this vein for a while, polite and surface level, everyone feeling each other out, testing the waters. Marcus answered questions about his business, his plans for the future, his childhood in the city. He was careful not to brag or oversell himself, sticking to simple, honest answers that seemed to satisfy the Whitmore's curiosity. He noticed the way Evelyn watched him when she thought he was not looking, her eyes assessing, but not unkind. He noticed the way Richard nodded thoughtfully at his answers, as if re-evaluating assumptions he had made long ago. Even Jonathan seemed to warm up as the conversation progressed, asking follow-up questions about the technology behind the companion and the challenges of scaling a hardware product. The house itself was beautiful, filled with antiques and family photographs and the warm glow of lamplight reflecting off polished wood floors. A fire crackled in the living room fireplace, and the smell of roasting turkey drifted in from the kitchen, mingling with hints of cinnamon and sage and the sweet, yeasty scent of fresh rolls. It was the kind of house Marcus had seen in magazines, the kind of house he had never imagined himself sitting in, let alone being welcomed into. But here he was, and it felt, if not quite like home, then at least like somewhere he could belong. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, around a table set with fine china and crystal glasses and a centerpiece of autumn flowers that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The table was long enough to seat a dozen people, and every place was taken, family members arranged according to some invisible protocol that Marcus did not understand but accepted without question. Marcus sat between Sophie and an elderly aunt named Clara, who reminded him a little of his own mother, with kind eyes and a gentle way of speaking. On Sophie's other side sat Jonathan, who was engaged in a conversation with a cousin about some recent development in the financial markets. Across the table, Evelyn presided over the meal with quiet efficiency, making sure every dish was passed and every glass was filled. The food was extraordinary. A golden turkey that practically fell off the bone, mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, stuffing made from scratch with fresh herbs and homemade bread, cranberry sauce that balanced sweet and tart in a way that made Marcus close his eyes with pleasure, green beans with almonds, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, warm dinner rolls that melted in his mouth. As he ate, Marcus thought about all the Thanksgivings he had spent alone, eating takeout from a container while he worked on his laptop. All the holidays when he had tried not to think about what he was missing, had tried to convince himself that he did not need what other people had. And now here he was, surrounded by warmth and abundance and the kind of family togetherness he had only ever observed from a distance. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. "Sophie tells me you started your company because of your mother," Clara said softly, leaning toward him so as not to interrupt the other conversations happening around the table. "Sophie tells me you started your company because of your mother," Clara said softly, leaning toward him so as not to interrupt the other conversations happening around the table. "That's a beautiful reason to do something. She must have been a wonderful woman." "She was," Marcus said, feeling that familiar ache in his chest, the one that never quite went away. "She was a nurse, spent her whole life taking care of other people. I wanted to honor that, to create something that would help people the way she did." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening. "I lost my husband 10 years ago, and the loneliness is, well, it's the hardest part. Having something like your device, something that keeps you connected to the people you love, that would mean the world to someone like me." "I'd be happy to send you one," Marcus said. "On the house," It's the least I can do." Clara's face lit up, and she patted his hand with papery fingers. "You're a good young man," she said. "Sophie chose well." As dinner progressed, Marcus began to relax. The Whitmores were not the villains he had imagined in his darker moments. They were just people, flawed and complicated like everyone else, with their own fears and insecurities and blind spots. They had judged him unfairly, yes, but they were trying to make amends now, in their own imperfect way. It was not until dessert was being served that the moment Marcus had been dreading finally arrived. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat and set down his fork, his expression growing serious. "Marcus, I owe you an apology." The table went quiet, all eyes turning to the patriarch of the family. Marcus set down his own fork and waited, his heart beating a little faster. "Last year, when Sophie first told us about you, I made a judgment based on things that I now realize were not important. I looked at where you came from, what you did for work, and I assumed I knew who you were. I was wrong." Richard paused, his jaw tightening as if the words were difficult for him to say. "I should have given you a chance. I should have trusted Sophie's judgment. And I should have remembered that success isn't about where you start. It's about where you end up." Marcus was quiet for a moment, letting the apology settle over him. A year ago, these words would have meant everything. Now they felt smaller, somehow. Not because they were not sincere, but because Marcus had already moved past the need for them. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore," he said finally. "And I understand. It's not easy to trust someone you don't know, especially when it comes to your family. I don't hold it against you." "You're more gracious than I deserve," Richard said, and there was genuine humility in his voice. "I hope we can start fresh, get to know each other properly this time." "I'd like that," Marcus said, "and please call me Marcus." Sophie's hand found his under the table, squeezing tightly, and when Marcus looked at her, he saw tears streaming down her cheeks, happy tears, grateful tears. He squeezed back and turned to smile at the rest of the family, who were watching this exchange with a mixture of relief and warmth. "Now," Evelyn said, her voice bright with forced cheer, "who wants pie?" The rest of the evening passed in a haze of pleasant conversation, excellent food, and the gradual thawing of old tensions. Marcus found himself talking with Jonathan about business strategy, with Clara about her late husband's love of fishing, with various aunts and uncles about everything from politics to gardening. By the time the last dishes were cleared and the guests began to say their goodbyes, he felt like he had been given a gift, the gift of belonging, of being seen and accepted for who he truly was. As Marcus and Sophie walked to her car in the cool night air, their breath-forming little clouds that floated up toward the stars, Sophie stopped and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming, for being so gracious, for not making this about revenge or proving a point." "Why would I do that?" Marcus asked. "Your family was never my enemy. They were just people who didn't know me yet. Now they do, and I hope they like what they see." "They do," Sophie said, stepping closer to wrap her arms around him. "They love what they see, and so do I." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet darkness, listening to the distant sound of an owl hooting in the trees. The house behind them glowed with warm light, and somewhere inside, Marcus could hear laughter, the sound of a family coming together, the sound of healing. "You know what I realized tonight?" Marcus said, his voice soft. "Success isn't really about the money or the business or any of that. It's about this. It's about having people who love you, who accept you, who want you to be part of their lives. That's the real measure of a person's worth." Sophie pulled back to look at him, her eyes shining. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Marcus said, thinking of his mother. "And I have a good partner." They kissed under the stars, slow and sweet, and when they finally pulled apart, Marcus felt a peace settle over him that was deeper than anything he had ever known. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, still full of challenges and surprises, but he was not walking it alone. He had Sophie, he had her family, he had the memory of his mother watching over him, and that, he realized, was worth more than all the money in the world. The drive back to Havenwood was quiet and peaceful, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness as they wound through the hills. Sophie had the radio on low, something soft and instrumental, and Marcus leaned his head against the window and watched the stars appear through the bare branches of the trees. He thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The rejection, the determination, the breakthrough, the success, the return. It felt like a story, like something that happened to other people, and yet here he was, living it, breathing it, carrying it in his bones. And the strangest part was that he did not feel triumphant. He did not feel like he had won some great victory or proven anyone wrong. He just felt grateful. Grateful for the journey, grateful for the lessons, grateful for the people who had believed in him when he had struggled to believe in himself. "Penny for your thoughts," Sophie said softly, glancing over at him. Marcus smiled. "Just thinking about how strange life is. A year ago, I was spending Thanksgiving alone, working on a dream that felt impossible, and now, look at us, look where we are." "It's not strange," Sophie said. "It's exactly what was supposed to happen. You worked hard, you stayed true to yourself, and the universe rewarded you. That's not strange. That's justice." "The gentle kind," Marcus agreed. "The kind that doesn't hurt anyone, just corrects things, puts them right." They pulled into Havenwood just as the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down from the sky like tiny feathers, dusting the rooftops and the bare trees and the quiet streets. Sophie parked in front of Marcus's building, and they sat there for a moment, watching the snow, not wanting the night to end. "Come upstairs," Marcus said. "I'll make hot chocolate. We can watch the snow from the window." "That sounds perfect," Sophie said. They climbed the stairs to Marcus's apartment, shaking the snow from their coats, laughing softly at nothing in particular. The apartment was just as he had left it, small and tidy and full of warmth, and Marcus put on the kettle while Sophie curled up on the sofa with the knitted blanket. When the hot chocolate was ready, Marcus brought 2 mugs to the sofa and settled beside her, pulling part of the blanket over his own lap. They sat there in the soft lamplight, watching the snow fall outside the window, feeling the warmth of the mugs in their hands and the warmth of each other's presence. "I have something to tell you," Sophie said after a while, her voice quiet and tentative. Marcus looked at her, noticing the way her cheeks had flushed, the way her fingers were fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, and then she smiled, that beautiful smile that had first captured his heart in the library all those years ago. "I'm pregnant," she said. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Marcus could not speak. The words hung in the air between them, shimmering like the snow outside the window, and then they settled into his heart, and he felt a joy so vast and overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. "A baby," he whispered. "Sophie, that's wonderful. That's the most wonderful thing I've ever heard." She laughed, a sound of pure happiness, and threw her arms around him, nearly spilling both their mugs of hot chocolate. Marcus held her tight, feeling her heart beating against his, feeling the future opening up before them like a flower blooming in spring. "I was going to wait until Christmas to tell you," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "But I couldn't. Not after tonight. Not after seeing how my family finally accepted you, how everything fell into place. It felt like the right moment." "It's the perfect moment," Marcus said. "The perfect ending to a perfect day." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, dreaming of the future. They talked about names and nurseries and all the things they would teach their child. They talked about the life they would build together, the home they would make, the love they would share. And outside, the snow continued to fall, covering Havenwood in a blanket of white, muffling the sounds of the world until everything was still and quiet and at peace. Eventually, Sophie's eyes began to droop, her head growing heavy on Marcus's shoulder. He kissed her forehead and gently disentangled himself, helping her to the bedroom and tucking her in with the tenderness of someone handling something infinitely precious. "Stay with me," she murmured, already half asleep. "Always," Marcus said, and he climbed in beside her, pulling her close, feeling her body relax against his. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, thinking about everything that had led to this moment, the struggles, the setbacks, the small victories that had piled up, one on top of another, until they became something extraordinary. He thought about his mother, and he hoped she was watching from somewhere, proud of the man he had become. And as sleep began to claim him, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. not because he was rich now, or successful, or accepted by the people who had once rejected him, but because he had stayed true to himself, because he had never let bitterness take root in his heart, because he had chosen love and forgiveness over anger and revenge. That, he realized, was the real treasure, the real victory, the real measure of a life well lived. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet joy and gentle preparation. Sophie moved into Marcus's apartment, and together they began to transform the small space into something that could accommodate their growing family. They painted the bedroom a soft, soothing green, the color of new leaves in spring, and set up a small corner with a crib and a rocking chair that Harold had given them, an antique that had been in his family for generations. Christmas came and went, a warm and wonderful affair spent with both families, the Whitmores and the small chosen family Marcus had built in Havenwood. Harold was there, and Catherine Wells had flown in from Boston to celebrate the company's first full year in business. Even Clara, Sophie's elderly aunt, had made the journey, clutching the companion device that Marcus had given her and showing it off to everyone who would listen. "This young man changed my life," she told anyone who would listen. "I talk to my grandchildren every day now. I don't feel so alone anymore." The new year brought more growth for the companion. The company had been featured in several national publications, and orders were coming in faster than they could fill them. Marcus hired more employees, moved to an even larger office, and began working on new features that would make the device even more helpful for elderly users. But through it all, he never lost sight of why he had started in the first place. He never let the success go to his head, and he never forgot where he came from. One evening in early February, as the winter began to loosen its grip on Havenwood and the first signs of spring appeared in the form of tiny green shoots pushing through the frozen ground, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything once again. It was from a representative of a major technology company, one of the biggest in the world. They had been watching the companion's success with great interest, and they wanted to make an offer. A very generous offer. An offer that would make Marcus wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. He listened to the proposal in stunned silence, the numbers dancing in his head like fireflies in the summer night. It was more money than he had ever imagined, more than he could ever spend in a lifetime. And all he had to do was sign a piece of paper and walk away. But walking away meant giving up control. It meant trusting someone else to carry on his mother's legacy. It meant letting go of the dream he had nurtured for so long. Marcus told the representative he needed time to think, and he hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the wall where a photo of his mother hung. She was smiling in the picture, that warm, wonderful smile that he still saw when he closed his eyes at night. What would she want him to do? He thought about it for a long time, and then he called Sophie and asked her to come to the office. She arrived 20 minutes later, her belly now visible beneath her winter coat, her face glowing with the radiance that seemed to come with pregnancy. She sat down across from him, and he told her about the offer, watching her expression shift from surprise to thoughtfulness to something that looked like pride. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Part of me wants to take the money and walk away. We could buy a house, put money away for the baby, never worry about finances again. But another part of me, the bigger part, doesn't want to let go. This company isn't just a business to me. It's my mother's legacy. It's my purpose. I don't know if I can hand that over to someone else." Sophie reached across the desk and took his hand. "Then don't," she said simply. "Keep the company. Keep building it. Keep making it better. The money will come eventually, and when it does, it will be on your terms. You're not disappointed?" The offer was... It was a lot of money, Sophie. Life-changing money. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Marcus, our life has already changed. We have each other. We have a baby on the way. We have a home and a community and people who love us. What more could money buy us that we don't already have?" Marcus looked at her, at this woman who had believed in him from the very beginning, who had stood by him through every rejection and every triumph, who was now carrying his child, and he felt a love so fierce and so profound that it took his breath away. "I love you," he said. "Have I told you that today?" "You have," she said, smiling. "But I don't mind hearing it again." Marcus declined the offer. The representative was surprised, but Marcus explained his reasons calmly and clearly. The companion was not just a product to him, it was a mission, and he was not finished with it yet. Instead of selling, He used the offer as leverage to secure additional funding on his own terms, maintaining control of the company while bringing in the resources he needed to expand. He opened new offices in 3 more cities, hired dozens of new employees, and began developing partnerships with hospitals and retirement communities across the country. By the time spring arrived in full force, with flowers blooming on every corner and birds singing in every tree, the Companion had become one of the most successful startups in the region, and Marcus had become, almost without realizing it, a millionaire. But the money mattered less to him than the impact. Every day he received letters and emails from people whose lives had been changed by his device. A daughter in California who could now see her mother's face every morning, a grandfather in Maine who no longer felt isolated in his rural home, a widow in Texas who had found a community of friends through the Companion's social features. These were the stories that mattered. These were the reasons he got out of bed every morning. These were the proof that his mother's legacy was alive and well. The baby came in May, on a warm afternoon when the apple trees were in full bloom and the air smelled of lilacs. A little girl, with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's auburn hair. They named her Rose, after Marcus's mother. Holding her for the first time, Marcus felt something shift inside him, something fundamental and permanent. He had thought he understood love before, but this was something else entirely. This was love distilled to its purest form. Love that asked for nothing and gave everything. Love that would shape the rest of his life. "Hello, little one," he whispered, cradling her against his chest. "Welcome to the world. You're going to love it here, I promise." Sophie watched from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant, and Marcus looked at her, at their daughter, at the life they had built together. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything, for believing in me, for never giving up. For this." "Thank you for being the kind of person worth believing in," Sophie replied. "Now come here. I want to hold both of you." Marcus climbed onto the bed beside her, careful not to jostle the baby, and they lay there together, the 3 of them, a new family, a new beginning. The months that followed were a blur of late-night feedings and diaper changes and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes with new parenthood. But they were also filled with joy, with laughter, with moments of such profound tenderness that Marcus sometimes had to stop and catch his breath. Rose grew quickly, as babies do, reaching milestones that seemed to arrive too fast and yet not fast enough. She learned to smile, to laugh, to roll over. She grabbed at toys with chubby fingers and babbled in a language only she understood. And through it all, Marcus was there, watching, marveling, falling more in love with her every single day. The second Thanksgiving since he had been welcomed into the Whitmore family approached, and this time the celebration was held at Marcus and Sophie's home, which they had moved into just a few months earlier. It was a modest house on a quiet street with a big backyard and a wraparound porch, the kind of house Marcus had always dreamed of owning but never thought he would. The whole family came, Evelyn and Richard, who had become regular visitors and surprisingly doting grandparents. Jonathan, who had warmed considerably and now sought Marcus's business advice regularly. Clara, who had become like a grandmother to Rose and who never went anywhere without her companion. And Harold, of course, who sat in the place of honor at the head of the table and told stories about the old days while everyone listened with patient affection. As Marcus looked around the table at all these people, at the family he had found and the family he had created, he felt a fullness in his chest that he had no words for. This was everything he had ever wanted. Not the money, not the success, but this. Connection, belonging, love. After dinner, when the dishes had been cleared and the guests were settling into comfortable chairs for coffee and conversation, Marcus slipped outside onto the porch. The evening was cool and crisp, and the stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Sophie found him there a few minutes later, carrying Rose in her arms. The baby was asleep, her face peaceful and content, and Sophie settled into the rocking chair beside Marcus with a contented sigh. "Thinking again?" she asked softly. "Always," Marcus admitted. "But good thoughts this time. The best thoughts." "Tell me." Marcus took a moment to gather his words, looking out at the quiet street, at the warm glow of lamplight and windows, at the gentle world that had become his home. "A few years ago," he said, "I was nobody. A hardware store clerk with a dream and an empty bank account. Sophie's family thought I was not good enough, and honestly, sometimes I wondered if they were right. But I kept going. I kept believing, and now look at us." He gestured at the house behind them, at the warmth and laughter spilling through the windows. "I'm not proud because I'm rich now. I'm not proud because I proved anyone wrong. I'm proud because I stayed true to who I am. I never let the rejection make me bitter. I never let the success make me arrogant. I just kept being me, kept doing the work, kept loving the people who mattered." Sophie reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "That's why they love you now," she said. "Not because of your money, because of who you are, who you've always been." Marcus nodded slowly. "And you know what? Even if the business failed tomorrow, even if we lost everything, I would still feel like the luckiest man in the world. Because I have you. I have Rose. I have this family, this community, this life. What more could anyone ask for?" They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply across the sky, feeling the cool night air on their faces. Rose stirred in Sophie's arms, making a small sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a coo, and then settled back into sleep. "I love you," Sophie said softly. "I love you too," Marcus replied. "More than I can ever say." The night deepened around them, and eventually they went back inside, where the warmth of the house and the warmth of family enveloped them like a blanket. The celebration continued for a while longer, but eventually the guests began to drift home, hugging goodbye and making promises to see each other soon. When the last of them had left, Marcus carried the sleeping Rose to her nursery and laid her gently in her crib. He stood there for a moment, watching her tiny chest rise and fall, marveling at the miracle of her existence. "Your grandmother would have loved you," he whispered. "She would have been so proud." He leaned down and kissed Rose's forehead, feather light, and then tiptoed out of the room, leaving the door open just a crack so the soft glow of the hallway light could creep in. Sophie was already in bed when he got to their room, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Marcus changed into his pajamas and climbed in beside her, pulling her close against his side. "Good Thanksgiving?" she murmured. "The best," he said. "The very best." They lay there in the quiet darkness, listening to the old house settle around them, to the distant hoot of an owl, to the soft rhythm of each other's breathing. Outside, the stars continued their ancient journey across the sky, and somewhere in the town below, a church bell chimed the hour, its sound floating through the night like a lullaby. Marcus closed his eyes and let the peace wash over him. The road had been long and winding, full of obstacles and detours, but it had led him here, to this moment, to this life, and for that he was endlessly grateful. Sleep came gently, like a tide rolling in, and Marcus let it carry him away. In his dreams, he saw his mother. She was standing in a garden full of flowers, smiling at him with that warm, familiar smile that he missed every single day. She did not speak, but she did not need to. Her eyes said everything. "I'm proud of you," they said. "You did good." Marcus smiled back at her, and then the dream faded, and he sank into a deeper sleep, dreamless and peaceful and complete. The next morning, he woke to the sound of birds singing outside the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Sophie was already up, moving quietly through the house, and Marcus could hear her soft voice talking to Rose in the nursery. He lay there for a moment, not quite ready to leave the warmth of the bed, just listening, just being. The sunlight was filtering through the curtains, casting golden squares on the floor, and everything felt gentle and slow and good. Eventually, he got up and padded downstairs, where Sophie had breakfast waiting on the table, and Rose was propped up in her high chair, gnawing happily on a teething ring. "Good morning," Sophie said, kissing him as he passed. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," Marcus said. "I dreamed about my mom." "Good dream?" "The best." They ate breakfast together, just the three of them, in the quiet of the morning. Outside, the world was waking up slowly, and Marcus could see the last of the autumn leaves drifting down from the trees in the backyard, landing softly on the frost-covered grass. After breakfast, he took Rose for a walk in the stroller, bundled up against the cold, and they made their way through the neighborhood, past houses decorated with wreaths and the last of the Halloween pumpkins that no one had bothered to remove yet. People waved at them from porches, called out greetings, stopped to coo over the baby. Marcus thought about how different this was from his life just a few years ago. The loneliness, the uncertainty, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in. And now here he was, pushing a stroller through a neighborhood where everyone knew his name, waving at people who had become friends, living a life that he once thought was out of reach. The universe had a way of correcting things, of putting people where they were meant to be. You just had to be patient enough to let it happen. When they got home, Sophie was on the phone with her mother, making plans for Christmas. Marcus settled Rose in her playpen and went to his study, where a stack of work waited for him. But instead of diving in immediately, he sat at his desk and looked out the window, watching a cardinal land on the branch of a maple tree. He thought about all the people the companion had helped, all the lonely seniors who were a little less lonely now, all the families who could stay connected despite the miles between them, all the small moments of joy and comfort that his work had made possible. That was his legacy. Not the money in his bank account, but the lives he had touched, the difference he had made. And it was only the beginning. Marcus turned back to his desk and picked up his pen. There was work to be done, ideas to explore, problems to solve, a world to make just a little bit better. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The house was warm, his family was safe, the future was bright. And that, Marcus thought, was more than enough. As the afternoon light began to fade and the shadows grew long across the floor, Marcus felt a gentle drowsiness settle over him. He had been working steadily, making notes and sketching designs, but now his eyelids were growing heavy and the words on the page were starting to blur. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, just for a moment. And in that moment, he thought about all the evenings still to come. The bedtime stories he would read to Rose, the quiet conversations he would have with Sophie after the baby was asleep, the Thanksgivings and Christmases and ordinary Tuesdays that would weave together into the fabric of a life. He thought about the challenges that would come, because life was never without challenges. But he knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that he would face them the way he had faced everything else, with patience, with determination, with love. The room was very quiet now. Outside, the last light of day was fading into the purple twilight, and the first stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking softly, steady and reassuring. Marcus let out a long, slow breath and felt his whole body relax. Everything was going to be all right. Everything was going to be better than all right. And with that thought, Marcus drifted into a peaceful sleep, cradled by the warmth of his home and the love of his family, carried by dreams of all the beautiful days yet to come. The story ends here, not with a dramatic finale, but with the quiet certainty of rest well earned. A young man who was once turned away from a family's table, now welcomed and cherished. A dreamer who turned his dreams into reality, not through revenge or bitterness, but through perseverance and grace. A son who honored his mother's memory by making the world a little bit kinder. Outside the window, the stars continue their slow dance across the sky. The town of Havenwood settles into sleep, its houses dark, its streets quiet, and somewhere in that gentle darkness, a family is at peace. Let yourself drift now, following Marcus into that soft twilight. Feel the warmth of the blankets around you. Feel the comfort of knowing that good things come to those who wait, who work, who believe. Feel the peace of a story well told, of a life well lived, of a night made for rest. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Let go of the day and all its worries. You are safe. You are warm. You are exactly where you are meant to be. And when morning comes, as it always does, it will bring with it new possibilities, new chances, new reasons to be grateful. But for now, there is only this moment, this quiet, this peace. Sleep well, and dream of gentle things. The end.